You know, they say that money is the ultimate equalizer. They tell you that if you work hard enough, if you climb high enough, you'll finally reach a place where the air is clear and the rules are the same for everybody. But I'm sitting here today, talking to you not just as a man who has spent 25 years building a company from the dirt up, but as a man who realized, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean at 35,000 feet, that some walls are built so high that even a billion-dollar balance sheet can't scale them. I've sat in boardrooms where the mahogany tables cost more than some people's houses. I've signed deals that moved markets, but none of that mattered when I was sitting in seat 2A on a flight from New York to London. I've closed deals that would make most people's heads spin, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the cold, soul-crushing weight of being offered a plastic tray of scraps in a cabin that cost me $10,000 to enter. Before I go any deeper into this, I need to ask you something. Have you ever felt like a ghost in a room you paid to be in? Have you ever walked into a space with your head held high, only to have someone's gaze cut you down to size before you even opened your mouth? If you've been there, if you know that specific kind of ache, do me a favor. Just drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching this from. I need to know I'm not just talking into a vacuum. I need to know that my brothers and sisters out there understand what it feels like to be invisible and hyper-visible all at the same time. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I don't usually share things this personal, this raw, but I think someone needs to hear this today. I was exhausted. That's the first thing you need to understand. I wasn't just long day at the office tired. I was soul weary. I'd just spent a week in New York burying my father. My old man was a giant of a human being, a man who spent 40 years as a janitor, wearing a uniform with another man's name on it, just so I could eventually wear a suit with my own name on the building. He used to tell me, "Son, the world is gonna try to tell you who you are. Don't you ever let it. You work twice as hard. You stay twice as sharp, and you never give them an excuse to look down on you." I took those words to heart. I became a machine. I studied. I worked. I sacrificed. And there I was, leaning back in a plush, buttery leather seat in first class, trying to process the fact that the man who taught me how to be a man was gone. The cabin was quiet. It had that filtered, expensive smell, a mix of high-end perfume, sanitized air, and the faint scent of warm nuts. I was wearing a charcoal gray suit, tailored to the inch. My shoes were polished. I looked like the CEO I am. But as soon as I stepped onto that plane, the atmosphere shifted. You know that feeling when the air in a room suddenly gets heavy? The flight attendant at the door, a woman in her late 20s with blonde hair pulled back so tight it looked painful, smiled at the woman in front of me. It was a genuine, welcome home kind of smile. When it was my turn, that smile didn't just fade. It evaporated. It was like a shutter clicking shut. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They slid over me, checking my boarding pass with a flick of her wrist, like she was inspecting a piece of suspicious mail. I didn't say anything. I'm used to it. You get a thick skin in my position. I walked to 2A, stowed my bag, and sat down. I just wanted to close my eyes and feel my father's presence one last time before the reality of my job pulled me back under. I was grieving, and grief makes you vulnerable. It strips away the armor. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a blanket and a few hours of peace. The man sitting next to me, in 2B, was a young kid, maybe 24 to what. He had a messy hoodie on, some beat-up sneakers, and he was glued to a gaming device. The flight attendant, let's call her Sarah, because she had a name tag that seemed to glow with a kind of sterile authority, came by almost immediately. She leaned over him with a warmth that felt like a physical heat lamp. "Can I get you started with some champagne, sir? Or perhaps a warm towel?" she asked, her voice like honey. He didn't even look up, just grunted something about a soda. She giggled, like he was the most charming person on the planet. Then she turned to me. The honey turned to ice. "We'll be taking off shortly. Make sure your seat is upright," she said. "No, sir." No offer of a drink. No warm towel. Just an instruction. I looked at her, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud in my chest. I thought about my father's janitor uniform. I thought about the sweat he poured into every floor he buffed so I wouldn't have to. I kept my voice low. "Professional. I'd love some water when you have a moment. Please. And a menu, if you don't mind." She didn't even acknowledge the request for the menu. She just nodded curtly and walked away. I sat there, staring at the back of the seat in front of me. The engine started to hum, a deep vibration that shook my bones. I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye, not because of her, but because of the exhaustion and the loss of my dad, and I quickly wiped it away. I couldn't be weak here. Not in this cabin. Not in this suit. As we reached cruising altitude, the service truly began. I watched Sarah and her colleague move through the cabin. It was like a choreographed dance of privilege. They brought out the menus, thick, cardstock beauties with gold foil lettering. They knelt beside the passengers, discussing the wine pairings, the origin of the beef, the delicate nature of the desserts. It was a performance of care. But when they got to my row, the dance skipped a beat. Sarah handed a menu to the kid in the hoodie. She spent 3 minutes explaining the special of the night to him, and then she simply stepped past me. She didn't miss me. You don't miss a 6'2" man in a charcoal suit in a cabin with only 8 seats. She chose to ignore me. It was a deliberate erasure. I waited. I told myself maybe she was going back to get a fresh menu. Maybe there was a mistake. 5 minutes passed. 10. The smell of searing steaks and herb butter began to waft through the air. My stomach gave a sharp, painful twist. I hadn't eaten since the funeral service 8 hours ago. I pressed the call button. The little ding sounded like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. Sarah appeared a few minutes later, looking like I had just interrupted her at a private dinner party. "Yes?" she asked, her hand on her hip, her eyes darting to the kid next to me as if to apologize for the noise. "I believe you forgot my menu," I said, keeping my tone as flat as possible. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me frustrated, and I'm still waiting on that water. She didn't even acknowledge the request for the menu. She just nodded curtly and walked away. I sat there, staring at the back of the seat in front of me. The engine started to hum, a deep vibration that shook my bones. I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye. Not because of her, but because of the exhaustion and the loss of my dad, and I quickly wiped it away. "Wait," I said. "Everyone else is already ordering. I'd like to see what the options are." She leaned in then. She didn't whisper, but she lowered her voice in a way that made it feel incredibly intimate and incredibly hostile. "Look, we had a lot of late additions to the manifest tonight. The premium meals were catered specifically for the confirmed bookings from 2 days ago. I don't have a menu for you because, frankly, there's nothing left on it for you to choose from." The kid in the hoodie looked up then, his eyes wide behind his glasses. I felt the blood rush to my face. A late addition. I had booked this seat 3 weeks ago. I had the receipt in my email. I had the status. I had the right to be there. But in her eyes, I was an interloper. I was someone who had somehow snuck past the gates, and she was the gatekeeper. "I'm not a late addition," I said, my voice trembling just a fraction. "I've had this reservation for weeks." She didn't even blink. "The system says what it says. If you're actually hungry, I can probably find some leftovers in the crew lounge. Some pasta from the back. maybe a roll. But I can't give you what I don't have. She said leftovers with a kind of casual cruelty that felt like a slap. In a cabin where people were sipping vintage Krug and cutting into medium rare fillets, she was offering me the scraps from the back of the plane. She was telling me that my $10,000 didn't buy me the same dignity as the person next to me. It wasn't about the food. It's never about the food, is it? It's about the message. It's about the way she looked at my hands. My dark, tired hands, and decided they didn't deserve to hold a silver fork. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a long, heart-wrenching ache that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with my pride. I thought about my father again. I thought about him cleaning those toilets, buffing those floors, always smiling, always being the good man. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second, I saw it. I saw the fear behind the arrogance. She wanted me to react. She wanted me to shout, to stand up, to give her a reason to call the captain and have me labeled as disruptive. She was baiting the angry black man she had been taught to expect. But I'm a CEO. I know how to manage a crisis. I know how to wait for the right moment to strike. Bring me whatever you have, I said, my voice coming out as a low growl. Bring the leftovers. I'd like to see exactly what you think I'm worth. She smirked. It was a tiny, ugly movement of her lips. I'll see what I can find, she said, and she spun on her heel, leaving me sitting there in the dim light of the cabin. I turned my head to the window. All I could see was the reflection of my own face against the blackness of the night sky. I looked tired. I looked old. I looked like a man who had spent his whole life running a race, only to find out the finish line kept moving. The kid next to me shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat, like he wanted to say something, but he went back to his game. The silence between us was like a canyon. 10 minutes later, Sarah returned. She didn't use a cart. She didn't use a linen cloth. She walked up to me carrying a single, cracked plastic tray, the kind they use in the very last row of economy. On it was a congealed pile of pasta with a thin, watery red sauce and a single, hard roll that looked like it had been sitting in a heater for 5 hours. She set it down on my tray table with a sharp clack. "Enjoy," she said, her voice dripping with a mock politeness that was more insulting than a curse word. I stared down at the tray. The steam rising from the pasta smelled like salt and despair. I looked at the silver cutlery the man in 2B was using, and then I looked at the flimsy plastic spork she had tossed onto my tray. My fingers reached out, hovering over the plastic. I felt them shaking. I gripped the edge of my buttery leather armrest, my knuckles turning a dusty gray under the strain, the expensive material groaning under the pressure of my grip, as I realized that the leftovers weren't just on the plate. They were how she saw my entire life. I sat there, paralyzed by the sheer, cold weight of the moment, staring at that pathetic tray while the laughter of other passengers echoed from the front of the cabin like a taunt. The steam from that plastic container rose up in a thin, greasy ribbon, carrying a scent that didn't belong in this cabin. It was the smell of a middle school cafeteria, overcooked starch and tomato paste that had been sitting under a heat lamp for far too long. I looked at the congealed mess, and then I looked at the man in 2B. He was cutting into a piece of sea bass that looked like it had been plated in a 5-star kitchen. The contrast was so sharp, it felt like a physical vibration in my ears. I felt a heat creeping up the back of my neck. A familiar, unwelcome guest I've spent my whole life learning to politely ignore. It's the heat of knowing you're being tested. It's the heat of realizing that no matter how many zeros are in your bank account, to some people, you are still just a body that shouldn't be occupying space. I picked up the plastic spork. It felt light and flimsy, like a toy. If I pressed too hard, it would snap. I thought about the thousands of people who work for me. I thought about the decisions I make every day that affect global markets. And here I was, being told to eat like a second-class citizen in a seat I had paid for with the sweat of my own brow. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I knew the script. If I raised my voice, I was the aggressive one. If I demanded to speak to the captain, I was entitled. If I stood up to stretch my legs too quickly, I was a threat. I had to be perfect. I had to be more than perfect. I had to be a saint just to be treated like a human being. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my father. I could see his hands, thick, calloused, and always stained with the gray dust of the warehouse floors he swept. He used to sit at our kitchen table, eating the cheapest cuts of meat my mother could find. But he always kept his back straight. He'd look at me and say, "Marcus, they can take your money. They can take your time. But they can't take your dignity unless you hand it over to them on a silver platter." I looked down at the plastic tray. This wasn't a silver platter, but the principle was the same. Sarah was waiting for me to hand over my dignity. She was hovering nearby, pretending to check the wine levels of the couple in 1A, but I could feel her eyes darting back to me. She was waiting for the explosion. She was waiting for me to prove her right. I decided to play a different game. I didn't eat the pasta. I just sat there, my back as straight as my father's used to be. And I opened my laptop. I had work to do. I had a merger to finalize, a deal that would literally reshape the industry. I focused on the glowing screen, the columns of numbers, the legal jargon that usually felt like a shield. I tried to drown out the sound of the metal forks clinking against china in the rows around me. I tried to ignore the fact that the cabin lights had been dimmed for everyone else's comfort, making it harder for me to see my keys. I had been working for maybe 20 minutes when I felt a shadow fall across my desk. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. The air around Sarah always seemed to drop a few degrees. "Sir, you'll need to stow that device," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a sharp, metallic edge that cut through the hum of the engines. I looked up slowly. The fasten seatbelt sign isn't on, and the person in 2B has been using his tablet since we took off. Why is my laptop a problem? She didn't even look at 2B. She kept her gaze fixed on the top of my head, like she couldn't bring herself to look me in the eye. It's a safety hazard for this specific seat configuration during this phase of the flight. Company policy. Company policy. I repeated. I knew the policy. I had flown this route 40 times in the last 3 years. I've never heard of a policy that applies to seat 2A, but not 2B. Could you show me that in the safety manual? She stiffened. I could see the muscles in her jaw tighten. I don't need to show you anything. Sir, I am the lead flight attendant on this deck, and I am telling you to stow the device. Now, unless you want me to report a non-compliance issue to the flight deck. There it was. The threat. The non-compliance tag. It was the digital version of a scarlet letter. If she reported me, it wouldn't matter who was right. I'd be flagged. I might be met by security at Heathrow. My reputation, my business, everything I had built could be tarnished by one woman's whim, because she didn't like the way I looked in a first-class cabin. The kid in the hoodie next to me actually paused his game. He looked at Sarah, then at me, then back at his own tablet, which was clearly visible and very much in use. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the silence of the cabin was heavy, and the social pressure to stay out of it was stronger. He looked away, turning his volume up. I was alone on an island of gray leather and plastic pasta. I slowly, meticulously closed my laptop. I felt a dull ache in my chest, a Ceylon feeling that I was being squeezed out of my own life. I tucked the computer into the side pocket of my seat. There, I said, my voice a whisper. Is there anything else I can do to make your flight more comfortable? Sarah. She didn't answer. She just walked away, her heels clicking a triumphant rhythm on the floor. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. The darkness behind my eyelids was better than the reality in front of me. I thought about the funeral I had just left. My father's casket had been simple, wood and brass. He didn't want anything flashy. He lived a quiet life of service, and he died with a clean conscience. I wondered if I was doing him a disservice by being here, by paying for this treatment. I wondered if the top was just a more expensive version of the bottom. About an hour later, when most of the cabin had fallen into a restless sleep, Sarah came back. This time, she was carrying a clipboard. She tapped me on the shoulder, waking me from a light, uneasy doze. "I need to see your boarding pass again," she said. I blinked, my eyes stinging from the dry air. "Again? You checked it when I boarded. You checked it when you brought the food. You know who I am. We've had a discrepancy in the manifest," she said, her voice loud enough to wake the woman in one being. "I need to verify that you are assigned to this seat. There's a concern that there may have been a seat swap without authorization." I felt a surge of adrenaline, the kind that hits you right before a fight. My hands were shaking as I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded slip of paper. I handed it to her. She took it with 2 fingers, as if it were something dirty. She held it up to her flashlight, squinting at it for what felt like an eternity. "Mr. Marcus Sterling?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "That's me, and you work for Sterling Global. I'm the CEO," I said, trying to keep the pride in my voice from sounding like a plea. She laughed. It was a short, dry sound. "Right? Well, this pass seems to be in order, but I'll need to keep it for a moment to run it through the system one more time, just to be sure." "You're taking my boarding pass?" I asked. "I need that for immigration." "You'll get it back when I'm done," she said, and she walked toward the galley before I could protest. I sat there, frozen. I was in the middle of the ocean, without my boarding pass, without my food, and without the right to use my own computer. I felt like a prisoner who had paid for the privilege of his own cage. The distinguished man in 1AA, an older white gentleman in a sweater vest, peeked over his sleep mask at me. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, the way you look at a crying baby on a long flight. He didn't see a CEO. He saw a problem. I looked back down at the tray of leftovers. The pasta had turned into a solid, cold brick. The sauce had separated into a clear, oily liquid and a dark red paste. I felt a wave of nausea. I thought about the millions of dollars I had donated to charities, the scholarships I had set up for kids who looked like me, the houses I had bought for my relatives. I had spent my whole life trying to prove that I belonged, that I was one of the good ones. And yet, here I was, being humiliated by a woman who probably made less in a year than I paid in taxes in a month. The unfairness of it was a physical weight on my lungs. It wasn't about the money. It was about the fact that she knew she could get away with it. She knew that in this tiny, pressurized tube at 35,000 feet, she held all the power. She could make my life a living hell. And if I fought back, I was the one who would lose. I looked over at the kid in 2B. He had finally put his game down. He was looking at the empty space where Sarah had stood, then at me. His face was pale. "That was messed up. Man," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine. I didn't answer. I couldn't. If I opened my mouth, I was afraid I'd either scream or cry, and I refused to do either. I just gave him a short, tight nod. "I'm Leo," he said, extending a hand. I saw the whole thing. The laptop, the food. "It's crazy, Marcus," I said, shaking his hand briefly. His grip was nervous. "I'm going to London for a tech conference," Leo said, trying to fill the awkward silence. I just sold my first app. My parents bought me this ticket as a graduation gift. I feel like I don't even belong here. You know, I'm just a kid in a hoodie, but they treat me like a king. And you look like you own the plane. And they're treating you like—" He trailed off, unable to find a word that wasn't an insult, like a late addition. I finished for him. "Yeah," he said, looking down at his sea bass, which was now cold and unappetizing. "Do you want some of this? I can't eat it now. Not after that." "No, thank you, Leo," I said. "I appreciate the offer, truly, but I think I'll just wait." I spent the next 2 hours staring at the leftovers. I didn't move them. I didn't touch them. I wanted them to stay right there, a silent witness to what was happening. I wanted Sarah to see them every time she walked by. I wanted her to see that I hadn't touched her offering. Every time she passed, she'd glance at the tray, her eyes narrowing. She'd linger for a second, as if waiting for me to ask for a napkin or a glass of water. But I remained as still as a statue. I was practicing the one thing my father taught me that was more important than hard work: patience. I was waiting for the mask to slip. I was waiting for her to make a mistake. The cabin was silent now, save for the rhythmic snoring of a few passengers and the constant, low-frequency roar of the wind against the fuselage. I felt the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a sudden, sharp drop that made the overhead bins creak, and the plastic tray on my table slide a few inches. The fasten seatbelt sign chimed, its yellow light illuminating the cabin like a warning flare. Sarah came marching down the aisle, her face set in a mask of professional concern. She went from row to row, checking belts. When she got to me, she didn't just check my belt. She reached down and tugged on it, hard, jerking my hips against the seat. "Make sure it's tight." "Sir," she snapped. "Safety is our priority." She reached for the plastic tray to take it away, perhaps to hide the evidence of her hospitality before the lights came up for breakfast. But as she grabbed the edge of the tray, her foot caught on the base of my seat. The plane gave another violent shudder, dropping another 50 feet in a heart-stopping lurch. The tray flew out of her hand. The cold, congealed pasta and the oily red sauce didn't just fall. They exploded. They sprayed across the front of my charcoal gray suit, across the leather armrests, and onto the pristine carpet of the first-class cabin. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. For the first time, her eyes weren't filled with arrogance. They were filled with a sharp, jagged panic. She looked at the mess on my chest, then at the mess on the floor, and finally, she looked at me. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just sat there, the cold sauce soaking through my expensive shirt, feeling the slow, heavy drip of the leftovers onto my lap. I looked her right in the eyes, my face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm, and I watched the color drain from her face until she was as white as the linen she had denied me. The red sauce was colder than I expected. That was the first thing that hit me. The temperature. It wasn't just lukewarm. It was a biting, greasy chill that began to seep through the fine weave of my charcoal wool jacket and into the crisp cotton of my shirt. It felt like a brand. It felt like Sarah had reached out and physically marked me with her contempt. I sat there, my hands still gripped tight on the armrests, watching a single, bloated piece of penny pasta roll off my lap and vanish into the deep pile of the carpet. The silence in the cabin was so thick, you could have cut it with one of those silver knives I wasn't allowed to have. Sarah was frozen, her hands suspended in midair, as if she could somehow catch the gravity and pull the mess back onto the tray. I didn't wipe it off. I didn't move. I just looked at her, and for a split second, I saw the mask of the perfect professional shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces of pure, unadulterated panic. She wasn't sorry because she had ruined a $5,000 suit. She wasn't sorry because she had humiliated a man who had done nothing but ask for a glass of water. She was terrified because she had lost control of the narrative. In her mind, I was supposed to be the one making the mess, the one being difficult. But there it was, the physical evidence of her own failure, splattered across the chest of a man who hadn't even raised his voice. I felt that old, familiar ache in my chest. That noi dao se long that comes when you realize that no matter how much you achieve, some people will only ever see you as a target for their leftovers. It's a weight that sits behind your ribs, making every breath feel like you're pulling air through wet sand. I'll get some napkins, she stammered, her voice thin and high. Stripped of all that fake honey, she turned and practically ran toward the galley, her heels stumbling on the floor. I looked down at the stain. It looked like a wound. I thought about my father's funeral, the smell of the lilies, the way the sun had hit the brass handles of his casket. I had worn this suit to say goodbye to the man who gave me everything, and now it was covered in the scraps of a world that didn't want me in it. I felt a tear prick the back of my eyes, but I swallowed it down. I wouldn't let the salt show. Not here. Suddenly, the air in the cabin changed. It wasn't the turbulence. The plane had settled into a steady, eerie glide, but there was a sound, a wet, rattling sound coming from row 1. I looked over the edge of my seat. The gentleman in Juanita, the one who had looked at me with that tired annoyance earlier, was slumped against the window. His sleep mask had slipped down around his neck, and his face, it wasn't the pale white of a sleeping man. It was a terrifying, dusky shade of purple. His chest was hitching in short, desperate jerks, and his hands were clawing feebly at the air, like he was trying to grab a rope that wasn't there. Help! A woman's voice gasped from 1B. It was his wife. She was wide awake now, her eyes filled with a primal terror that bypassed all the rules of first-class decorum. Somebody, please. He can't breathe. Arthur. The ding of the call button started going off like a frantic heartbeat. Ding, ding, ding. Sarah came rushing back out, her hands full of white linen napkins. She saw me, and for a second, I think she thought I was the one making the noise. But then she looked at row 1. She dropped the napkins. They fluttered to the floor like white birds with broken wings. She stood there, paralyzed. I've seen this look before. It's the look of someone who has been trained for the service, but not for the soul. She knew how to pour champagne, but she had no idea how to save a life. She started babbling something into her intercom, her fingers shaking so hard she dropped the handset twice. I didn't think. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't even think about the red sauce on my chest. I unbuckled my belt and stood up. My knees were stiff, and my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. But my mind was suddenly incredibly clear. Before I was a CEO, before I had the corner office and the driver, I was a young man in the reserves. I had spent hours in the windowless rooms learning how to keep a body alive when the world was falling apart. It's a skill you never really lose. It just sits in your muscle memory, waiting for the moment the lights go out. I stepped into the aisle, but as I moved toward row 1, Sarah suddenly blocked my path. She held out her hands, palms flat, her face twisted in a look of sheer, irrational desperation. "Sir, sit down," she hissed. It wasn't a request. It was a command fueled by a deep-seated fear. You are not authorized to leave your seat during a medical emergency. Sit down immediately. He's turning blue. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady, the voice I use when a board meeting is spiraling into chaos. "He's having a pulmonary embolism or a severe cardiac event. He doesn't have time for authorization." I said, "Sit down." She shouted, and this time, the whole cabin heard her. She actually put her hand on my chest, pushing against the wet, stained wool of my jacket. "We have a protocol. We are calling for a doctor. You are not. You are not the help we need." The words hung in the air, vibrating with all the things she wasn't saying. I looked at her hand on my chest, right over the red stain. She'd rather let that man die than trust that a man who looked like me, a man she had just fed scraps to, could be the one to save him. The irony was a bitter pill in the back of my throat. I felt the heat rising in me, the urge to just push past her, to show her exactly how much power I really had. But I knew the stakes. If I touched her, if I showed even a hint of aggression, she'd have the air marshals on me before I could say CPR. "Do you know who he is?" The voice came from 2B. Leo, the kid in the hoodie, had stood up. He wasn't looking at his game anymore. He was looking at Sarah with a look of pure, concentrated disgust. "Stay out of this, kid." Sarah snapped, her eyes darting between us like she was trapped in a cage with two predators. "No," Leo said, his voice gaining strength. "I know who he is. I follow his company. I saw him on the cover of Forbes last month. That's Marcus Sterling. He's not just some guy in a suit. He's the man who donated $10 million to build the new trauma center in Brooklyn. He knows what he's doing. Now get out of his way before you kill that man." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of a shift in the universe. I saw the gears turning in Sarah's head. She looked at me, then at the dying man in one eye, then back at Leo. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down. If Arthur died because she blocked me, she wasn't just losing a job. She was losing everything. She didn't apologize. She didn't even step aside gracefully. She just sort of wilted. She pulled her hand back like my suit was on fire and slumped against the galley wall, her face a mask of hollow shock. I didn't waste another second on her. I knelt in the cramped space of row 1. The smell of the man's expensive cologne was mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of sweat and fear. His wife was sobbing, her hands over her mouth. "Arthur, Arthur, can you hear me?" I asked, my fingers searching for the pulse in his neck. It was there, but it was thready, leaping under his skin like a frightened animal. "My name is Marcus. I'm going to help you. I need you to try and find a rhythm with me." "Okay." He couldn't answer. His eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites. He was slipping away. I looked around. "I need the medical kit. Now," I barked. Sarah didn't move, but another flight attendant, an older man who had been working the back of the cabin, came running up with a heavy orange box. I opened it, my hands moving with a precision that surprised even me. I felt the weight of my father's legacy in my shoulders, the dignity of the work, the quiet strength of the man who never backed down from a task. No matter how humble, I wasn't a CEO in that moment. I wasn't a late addition. I was just a human being trying to hold on to another human being's life in the middle of a dark sky. I began the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm of the work was a prayer. I could feel the man's ribs under my palms, the fragile cage of a life. Every time I pushed down, I felt the red sauce on my shirt sticking to my skin, a constant reminder of the world I was currently saving. I didn't care. I didn't care about the suit. I didn't care about the cabin. I just watched Arthur's face, waiting for a sign, waiting for the purple to recede. The cabin was a ghost ship. Nobody was talking. Even the engines seemed to have hushed their roar. I was aware of Leo standing behind me, a silent guardian. I was aware of Sarah, somewhere in the shadows, her world crumbling. But mostly, I was aware of the man beneath my hands. "Come on, Arthur," I whispered, the sweat dripping off my forehead and onto the stained lapel of my jacket. "Don't you leave your wife like this." Don't you give up in this cabin. You're worth more than this. I don't know how long I was there. Time doesn't work the same way when you're fighting for a soul. It could have been 5 minutes. It could have been an hour. My arms were screaming, a dull, throbbing ache that radiated up into my neck. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If I let go, the leftovers won. If I let go, Sarah's version of the world became the only truth. And then it happened. A sharp, gasping intake of breath. Arthur's chest jolted under my hands. A violent, beautiful heave of life. His eyes flickered, the pupils dilated but present. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. "He's back," I breathed, my voice cracking. "He's breathing." His wife let out a sob that sounded like a scream of joy. She grabbed my hand, my dark, stained hand, and pressed it to her cheek, her tears wetting my knuckles. "Thank you," she choked out. "Oh, God, thank you." I sat back on my heels, my body trembling with exhaustion. I looked down at my hands. They were covered in a mixture of red pasta sauce and the sweat of a man I had just saved. I looked up and saw the captain standing at the entrance of the cabin. He wasn't looking at the medical kit. He wasn't looking at the mess on the floor. He was looking directly at me, his face unreadable in the dim, emergency lighting. He looked at the late edition who was currently holding the life of his passenger in his hands. And then he looked at Sarah, who was still huddled against the wall, her eyes wide with a terror that no protocol could ever fix. I slowly wiped my brow with the back of my arm, the cold grease of the sauce smearing across my forehead as I stood up to face the man who was in charge of this flight, while the smell of ozone and the faint, sweet scent of the oxygen masks filled the air around us. The captain didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, the gold stripes on his sleeves catching the dim, flickering light of the emergency cabin lamps. He looked at Arthur, who was now being tended to by the other flight attendant with an oxygen mask. He looked at the sob-racked wife clutching Arthur's hand, and then his eyes settled on me. I was a sight, I'm sure. A tall black man kneeling in the aisle. My charcoal suit jacket, the one I'd worn to my father's graveside, now plastered with a drying, rust-colored smear of cheap tomato sauce. I felt the grit of it on my neck. I felt the weight of every silent judgment that had been passed since I boarded this plane. But I didn't look down. I stood up slowly, my joints popping, and I met his gaze with the same steady stare I use when I'm staring down a hostile takeover in a boardroom. I wasn't the late edition anymore. I was the only person in this cabin who had kept their head when the world started to slip. "Mr. Sterling?" the captain asked. His voice was deep, professional, but there was a tremor of something else in it. Recognition, relief. "Yes," I said, my voice raspy from the effort of the compressions. He took a step forward, extending a hand, not to push me away, but to steady me. "I'm Captain Miller. We were notified about 10 minutes ago by ground control that you were on the manifest. We've been trying to get a message through to the cabin crew to check on your comfort." He glanced over my shoulder at Sarah, who was still slumped against the galley wall, her face the color of bleached bone. "The CEO of this airline, David Grahams, is a personal friend of yours. I understand. He's actually on the satellite line right now. He wanted to personally apologize for the delay in New York and thank you for the consultation you provided on the merger last week. He said to tell you that the deal is closed. Thanks to you." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens when the floor of a building suddenly gives way. I felt Leo, the kid in 2B, let out a breath that sounded like a whistle. I saw the gentleman in 1A, Arthur, blink through his oxygen mask. his eyes focusing on me with a newfound clarity. But mostly, I felt the air being sucked out of Sarah's lungs. She didn't just look scared. She looked like she had just realized she'd been standing on a trapdoor her entire life. And she was the one who had pulled the lever. The captain looked down at the mess on my chest, then at the shattered plastic tray still lying on the floor. He wasn't a fool. He'd been flying for 30 years. He knew what crew lounge leftovers looked like, and he knew they didn't belong in first class. He looked back at Sarah, his eyebrows knitting together in a hard, dangerous line. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register, "explain to me why Mr. Sterling is covered in economy class pasta, and explain to me why he was the one performing CPR while you were standing in the galley." She couldn't speak. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. No honeyed words, no company policy, no late edition excuses. She just stood there, the reality of her own prejudice staring her back in the face in the form of a man who held her career and the life of her passenger in his stained hands. "Captain," I said, stepping in before she could lie. I wasn't doing it to save her. I was doing it because I was tired. I was tired of the drama, tired of the fight, and I just wanted to go home. There was a misunderstanding about the manifest, about what I was entitled to. Your flight attendant was just following what she thought were the rules. The rules, the captain barked. There is no rule in this sky that justifies treating a human being like a nuisance, especially not a passenger who just saved a man's life. I looked at Sarah. I didn't feel the noid au selong anymore. That pain, that heart-wrenching ache of being marginalized, had been replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. I saw her for exactly what she was, a small person trying to feel big by making someone else feel small. And in that moment, I realized that I didn't need her apology. I didn't even need her to be fired. I needed her to understand what she had nearly thrown away. "Captain," I said, "I don't want a scene. I don't want a report filed that ruins anyone's life. But I would like a clean shirt, and I would like Sarah to do something for me." The captain looked surprised, but he nodded. "Anything. Mr. Sterling, truly, I want her to sit in my seat," I said. The cabin went still. Sarah's eyes went wide. "Sir," she whispered, "sit in seat 2A. "Sarah," I said, my voice calm but unbreakable. "Right now, while I go change." She moved like a sleepwalker. She sat down in the buttery leather seat I had occupied for the last 6 hours. I walked to the galley, took a fresh shirt from my carry-on, a plain white one I'd kept for the arrival in London, and I changed right there. Shielded by the curtain, I washed the sauce off my skin with a warm cloth. I felt the cold water hitting my face, and I felt my father's presence again. "Son, keep your back straight." When I walked back into the cabin, I was clean. I looked like the man I was. I walked over to Sarah, who was sitting in my seat, looking small and terrified. I picked up the plastic tray from the floor, the one with the congealed pasta and the hard roll. I set it down on the tray table in front of her. "I didn't eat this," I said, looking down at her, "because I knew I was worth more than scraps. But I want you to look at it, really look at it. This is what you thought of me. You saw my skin, you saw my exhaustion, and you decided I didn't deserve a menu. You decided I didn't deserve a glass of water. You even tried to stop me from saving that man's life because you couldn't imagine I was qualified to help." A single tear rolled down her cheek, leaving a track through her perfect makeup. I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I know you are," I said, "but you're sorry because you got caught. You're sorry because the man you insulted turns out to be a friend of your boss. I want you to be sorry because Arthur almost died while you were worried about my laptop. I want you to be sorry because you let a plastic tray of leftovers become the measure of a human soul. I turned to the captain. She's had a long flight. Captain, maybe she needs a break when we land. But for now, I'm gonna sit in the galley for a while and talk to Leo. He's got a bright future in tech, and I think I might have a job for him. Leo beamed, his face lighting up like a Christmas tree. I walked back to row 2, but I didn't sit down. I looked at Arthur and his wife. He was breathing better now, the color returning to his cheeks. He looked at me and gave a small, weak thumbs up. I nodded back. That was all the first-class service I needed. As we began our descent into London, the sky outside the window started to turn a pale, bruised purple, the first light of dawn. I sat on a small jump seat in the back, away from the leather and the champagne. I felt a strange sense of peace. I hadn't let them take my dignity. I hadn't handed it over on a silver platter or a plastic tray. I had kept it, just like my father told me to. I'm telling you this story because I want you to know that the world will try to put you in a box. It will try to tell you that you don't belong in the premium seats of life. It will try to feed you the leftovers of its own fear and prejudice. But you don't have to eat it. You can stand up. You can be the help the world needs, even when the world is trying to push you down. Before I let you go, I want to ask you one more thing. Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between being angry and being better? Tell me about it in the comments. I'm going to be reading them, truly. And if this story reminded you of your own worth, please share it with someone. Hit that subscribe button and join this community. We're building something here, a place where we see the human first, the heart second, and the status not at all. As the wheels hit the tarmac at Heathrow, the plane gave a small, familiar jolt. I looked at my hands, clean, steady, and strong. I was a CEO, a son, and a man who had survived the storm. And as I walked off that plane, I didn't look back at the first-class cabin. I looked straight ahead, into the light of a new day, knowing that my father would have been damn proud of the man I had become. Peace to you all. And remember, never settle for the leftovers. You were born for the feast. I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the crisp London air, the weight of the night finally lifting off my shoulders.